October 14, 1947, London, 42 p.m. The Zebra Room within the Lenox Lounge, 288 Lenox Avenue. The air inside the lounge didn't smell like cigarettes and expensive bourbon anymore. It smelled like cordite and imminent death. 3 men stood by the chrome-lined bar, their hands tucked deep inside heavy wool trench coats. They weren't from Harlem. Their suits were cut in the wide, flashy style of Chicago, and their eyes were dead sharks swimming in a sea of neon light. In the center booth, Ellsworth, Bumpy. Johnson sat alone. On the table in front of him wasn't a weapon, but a glass of milk and a single, pristine white napkin. Across from him sat Frank, the butcher, Scarpato, a man whose reputation for dismembering rivals in the Windy City had traveled east long before he did. Scarpato had a .38 snub, nose leveled directly at Bumpy's chest under the table. The distance was less than 3 feet. A sneeze would trigger a massacre. The stakes: the entirety of the 118th Street numbers racket. $50,000 a week in cash flow. The sovereignty of Harlem itself. Scarpato grinned, a gold tooth flashing in the dim amber light. He thought he had the king of Harlem checkmated in his own castle. He thought the 3 shooters by the door blocked every exit. He thought this was the night the legend of Bumpy Johnson ended in a pool of blood on the mosaic tile floor. He was wrong. By midnight, one of these men would be the undisputed king of the underworld, and the other would be praying to a god he hadn't spoken to in 20 years, begging for the permission to simply walk away breathing. 4 weeks earlier, to understand why a Chicago hitman was sweating through his shirt in a Harlem jazz club, you have to understand the man sitting in the booth. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson wasn't just a gangster. In 1947, he was the heartbeat of Harlem. They called him the Professor as often as they called him Bumpy. He was a paradox wrapped in a bespoke suit, a man who could discuss the philosophy of Nietzsche with a university scholar at 2:00 p.m. and slit a rival's throat with a straight razor by 2:15 p.m. He didn't just run the numbers racket, he was the bank, the police force, and the government for 40 city blocks where the actual law refused to tread. But 1947 was a year of jagged edges. The post-war euphoria was fading. The streets were getting colder. The fragile peace between the Italian 5 families and Harlem's black underworld, a peace brokered by Lucky Luciano before his deportation, was fraying at the seams. With Luciano in exile in Italy and Vito Genovese hungry for consolidation, the unwritten treaties were turning into ash. Harlem was the prize. It was the Black Mecca, a cultural explosion of jazz and art, but beneath the rhythm of the Apollo Theater lay a river of cash. The policy racket, the numbers game, was generating millions. It was an economy unto itself, supporting families, businesses, and dreams in a segregated America. The Italians wanted a bigger slice. They didn't want to partner anymore. They wanted to conquer. They saw the black gangsters as employees, not equals. Bumpy Johnson was the only wall standing between Harlem's independence and total subjugation by the Commission. He was the dam holding back the flood, and everyone knew that if you want to break a dam, you don't chip away at the concrete. You use dynamite. That dynamite arrived on a train from Union Station, carrying a leather valise and a mandate from the Midwest to break Bumpy Johnson or bury him. The eyes of every hustler, pimp, and preacher from 110th to 155th Street were watching. If Bumpy folded, Harlem fell. If Bumpy fought, the streets would run red. The man sent to break the dam was Frank, the butcher, Scarpato. He wasn't a strategist. He wasn't a diplomat. Scarpato was a blunt instrument, a relic of the old Al Capone days when problems were solved with baseball bats in back alleys. He had cut his teeth in the Chicago outfit during the bloody wars of the early 30s. Legend had it he earned his nickname not because he owned a deli, but because he knew how to disassemble a human body into parcels small enough to fit in a meat locker. Scarpato arrived in New York with a simple objective: intimidation. The New York families were too entangled with Bumpy. They had business relationships, friendships, unspoken lines they wouldn't cross. The commission needed an outsider, someone who didn't care about the code of Harlem, someone who saw Bumpy Johnson not as a legend, but as an obstacle. In his first week in the city, Scarpato made his presence felt with terrifying efficiency. He didn't ask for meetings. He hijacked 2 of Bumpy's delivery trucks on 125th Street. He beat a collection runner near Sate, Nicholas Park, so badly the man spent a month in traction. He didn't steal the money. He burned it in a trash can while the runner watched, screaming. It wasn't about the cash. It was the message: we can touch you, we can hurt you. Your rules don't apply to us. Scarpato wanted the northern distribution routes for the new heroin trade that was trickling into the ports. Bumpy had famously kept the hard stuff at arm's length, refusing to poison his own well. Scarpato saw that morality as a weakness. The ultimatum came via a dead canary left on the hood of Bumpy's car outside the Theresa Hotel. A note was tied to its leg: the lounge. Tuesday. Midnight. Come alone, or we burn the whole neighborhood. It was a direct challenge to the throne. A brute force warrior was calling out the chess master. Scarpato had the muscle, the backing of the Chicago outfit, and the element of surprise. He had 12 confirmed kills to his name. He was a shark entering a koi pond, but he had made the classic mistake of the arrogant conqueror. He assumed that, because Bumpy read books, he had forgotten how to shoot. Scarpato's plan was textbook Chicago mob tactics: overwhelming force in a confined space. He chose the Lenox Lounge because it was Bumpy's living room. Taking the king in his own throne room was the ultimate power move. He positioned 2 men at the front entrance, 1 at the rear kitchen exit, and kept his best shooter, a psychopath named Vinny, the mute, at the bar. The plan was foolproof. Bumpy would walk in. Scarpato would demand 60% of the numbers take and full access for heroin distribution. If Bumpy refused, he wouldn't leave the booth. If he agreed, he would leave as a puppet. At 11:10:30 p.m., the Lenox Lounge was vibrating with the low hum of nervous energy. The regulars knew something was wrong. The usual laughter was absent. The jazz trio in the corner played Mood Indigo, but the drummer was dragging the beat, his eyes darting toward the door. The air was thick with the scent of stale tobacco, hair pomade, and fear. The distinctive Art Deco zebra patterned walls of the lounge seemed to close in, creating a claustrophobic tunnel. At 11:35 p.m., Scarpato sat in the prime booth. He ordered a scotch neat. He placed his fedora on the table, a signal to his men. He checked his watch. He checked the door. He wiped a speck of dust from his cufflink. 11:42 p.m., the heavy oak door swung open. The street noise from Lenox Avenue, a passing siren, the shout of a vendor, burst in for a split second before being cut off. Bumpy Johnson entered. He didn't walk like a man walking to his execution. He strolled. He wore a charcoal gray double-breasted suit, immaculate, with a pearl gray tie. He stopped to shake the hand of the hat-check girl. He nodded to the bartender. He looked at Scarpato's men, the Chicago muscles standing like statues, and offered them a faint, almost pitying smile. He slid into the booth opposite Scarpato. "Frank," Bumpy said. His voice was gravel wrapped in velvet. "You're a long way from Lake Michigan." Scarpato leaned forward. The smell of garlic and aggressive cologne wafted across the table. "And you're a long way from retirement, old man. Unless you sign the papers I brought." "Papers?" Bumpy picked up the glass of milk the waiter had placed silently before him. "I thought we were here to drink." "We're here to settle accounts," Scarpato hissed. Under the table, his hand tightened on the grip of his. 38. 60%. "Tonight, or you don't walk out that door." 11:50 p.m. The tension was a physical weight. The jazz band had stopped playing. They were packing up their instruments with frantic haste. "Look around, Bumpy," Scarpato whispered, gesturing with his eyes to his men by the exits. "I got the front. I got the back. I got the bar. You got a glass of milk." Bumpy took a slow sip. He licked a drop of milk from his upper lip. He looked at his watch. "You have 3 men, Frank. Vinny at the bar. Sal and Dom at the door. I got enough to turn you into a colander. And you have a gun under the table," Bumpy continued, his voice monotone. "A. Smith & Wesson, if I had to guess. Reliable. Noisy. It gets the job done, does it?" Bumpy asked. He leaned in closer. The air between them crackled. "You see, Frank, that's the difference between Chicago and Harlem. In Chicago, you think power is a gun. In Harlem, power is knowing who loaded it." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a held breath. The silence of a fuse burning into the casing. Scarpato blinked. "What?" "Check your chamber, Frank. You're bluffing." "Am I?" Bumpy's eyes hardened. The professor was gone. The killer was home. "Pull the trigger. Right now. Blow a hole in my stomach. But if it clicks, you belong to me." Scarpato's face went pale. Sweat beaded on his upper lip. His finger twitched on the trigger. The physics of the situation fought against his psychology. He had checked the gun at the hotel. He knew it was loaded. But Bumpy's eyes, they were the eyes of a man who had already read the end of the book. The seconds stretched out like hours. Tick, tick. Scarpato couldn't do it. The doubt was a poison. What Scarpato didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that the war had been won 3 days ago. Bumpy hadn't just been sitting around while Scarpato burned his trucks. He had been working the phones. He had reached out to the valet at the hotel where Scarpato was staying. He had reached out to the maid service. He had reached out to the very structure of the city. 3 steps ahead. While Scarpato was busy intimidating runners, Bumpy had located Scarpato's weakness, his vanity. Scarpato used a specific local barber on 125th Street for his daily shave. The barber, a man named Old Man Jenkins, owed Bumpy for his grandson's college tuition. During a hot towel shave that morning, while Scarpato's gun hung in its holster on the coat rack, a switch was made. Not the gun itself. Scarpato would notice the weight difference. But the firing pin. A skilled mechanic from the garage next door had filed it down by 2 millimeters. Just enough to render the weapon a heavy paperweight. But Bumpy didn't stop there. As Scarpato hesitated in the booth, Bumpy raised a single finger. At the bar, Vinny, the mute, Scarpato's best shooter, suddenly stiffened. He felt something sharp press against his kidney. The bartender, a man Scarpato had ignored as the help, was holding a jagged ice pick against Vinny's spine. At the door, the 2 Chicago heavies felt the cold steel of shotgun barrels against the back of their necks. 2 patrons, who had been quietly reading newspapers near the entrance, had dropped their papers to reveal sawed-off Remingtons. Bumpy smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. You looked at the room, Frank. But you didn't see the room. You saw furniture. I saw family. Bumpy reached into his jacket pocket. Scarpato flinched, expecting a weapon. Instead, Bumpy pulled out a single, folded piece of paper. He slid it across the table. It wasn't a hit list. It was a train ticket, one way. New York to Chicago. Departing at 1:00 a.m. You have 40 minutes to get to Penn Station, Bumpy said softly. The boys at the door will drive you. If you miss that train, well, the East River is very cold this time of year. Scarpato looked at the ticket, then at his paralyzed men, then at his useless gun. He realized with a sickening thud that he was the only person in the room who wasn't in on the joke. "You're letting me go," Scarpato whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm not letting you go," Bumpy corrected, leaning back and finishing his milk. "I'm sending you back as a message. Tell the outfit that Harlem has a king, and kings don't lose to men who—" Frank Scarpato stood up. His legs were shaking. He looked like a man who had stared into the sun and gone blind. He didn't say a word. He didn't threaten. He simply took the ticket. He signaled to his men, who were relieved of their weapons by Bumpy's crew, and they walked out of the Lenox Lounge with their heads bowed. As the door closed behind them, the silence held for one more second. Then, Bumpy tapped his glass on the table. The band immediately kicked back into mood indigo, picking up exactly where they left off. The conversations resumed. The laughter returned. It was as if the angel of death had stopped by for a drink and decided to leave a tip. Scarpato made his train. He went back to Chicago and told the outfit that Bumpy Johnson was a sorcerer. He told them Harlem was impenetrable. The Chicago incursions stopped. The Italian families in New York, hearing of how Bumpy dismantled a top enforcer without firing a single shot, deepened their respect. They realized that Bumpy wasn't just a gangster they could muscle. He was a partner they had to negotiate with. That night at the Lenox Lounge cemented Bumpy's legend. It proved that he didn't hold power just because he was violent. He held power because he was smarter than everyone else in the room. He had turned an assassination attempt into a masterclass in psychological warfare. He hadn't just saved his territory, he had elevated his status to myth. This confrontation illustrates why Bumpy Johnson reigned for as long as he did. In a world defined by the erratic violence of men like Dutch Schultz or Mad Dog Cole, Bumpy brought order, intellect, and strategy. He understood that violence was a tool of last resort. True power was control of your environment, your enemy's perception, and the people around you. Bumpy Johnson was a criminal, yes, but he viewed himself as a race man and a protector. He used the tools of the underworld to build a fortress around Harlem that even the might of the mafia couldn't easily breach. He demanded respect not by shouting, but by being the quietest man in the room. The lesson from the Zebra Room is timeless. Brute force is fragile. It can be outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and broken. Real power isn't about the gun in your hand. It's about the preparation you did before you ever walked through the door. If you stay ready, you never have to get ready. If this story showed you why Bumpy Johnson was the smartest man to ever walk the streets of Harlem, hit that subscribe button. Drop a like if you respect the code of the old school. And tell me in the comments, would you have taken the train or tried to pull the trigger? Next week, we're going deep into the vaults to uncover the time Lucky Luciano tried to cross Bumpy and realized he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. You don't want to miss it.